I never thought sXXing my boyfriend on abandoned railway tracks would end with us running for our lives from an oncoming train, but here we are. I'm a 24-year-old college student, and this is the story of how one night seeking romance and danger in what we thought was a forgotten place turned into the most terrifying experience of my life and taught me that some risks aren't edgy or exciting. They're just stupid and potentially fatal. Chris and I had been together for 5 months when this happened, and those 5 months had been intense in the best way. We met at a local music venue where his band was playing. I was there with friends, and he was on stage playing bass, and something about watching him perform just drew me in completely. After the show, I worked up the courage to approach him. We started talking, and by the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers and made plans to meet up again. Our first real date was exploring an abandoned warehouse district taking photos, and that set the tone for our relationship. We were both drawn to urban exploration, to finding beauty in forgotten places, to that specific thrill that comes from being somewhere you're not supposed to be. Chris was a musician, which meant he kept irregular hours and had this creative, spontaneous energy that I found incredibly attractive. I was a literature major, spending most of my time buried in books and papers, living a pretty structured and conventional student life, so being with him felt like stepping into a different world, one where normal rules didn't quite apply. He introduced me to parts of the city I'd never known existed, hidden spots under bridges, rooftops with incredible views, abandoned buildings with amazing graffiti art. Every date with him felt like an adventure, and I loved that about us, loved the way he made ordinary life feel exciting and full of possibility. That particular night in late June, Chris texted me around 10 p.m. saying he wanted to show me something cool, asking if I was free to meet up. I'd been studying for a summer session exam, but I was ready for a break, so I told him yes, and he picked me up from my apartment about 30 minutes later. We drove to the outskirts of town, past the industrial areas and into this zone that was technically still part of the city, but felt completely separate from it. All warehouses and empty lots and infrastructure that nobody paid much attention to anymore. He parked in a gravel lot next to what looked like it might have once been a factory of some kind, long since closed and abandoned, and told me we were going to walk along some old railway tracks that he'd discovered recently. I'd never really thought about abandoned railway tracks before, never considered them as a destination or something to explore, but as we started walking I could see the appeal. The tracks stretched out in both directions, cutting through this liminal space between city and countryside, with overgrown vegetation on both sides, and the gravel crunching under our feet with each step. It was dark except for moonlight and the distant glow of the city behind us, creating this atmosphere that was simultaneously romantic and slightly eerie. Chris held my hand as we walked, telling me stories about the history of these tracks that he'd researched online, about how they used to be a major freight line but had been abandoned decades ago when new routes were built, about urban legends that locals told about ghost trains that supposedly still ran these tracks at night. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, just talking and enjoying being together in this unusual setting, when we came to a small bridge where the tracks crossed over a drainage ditch. The bridge was only maybe 15 feet long, but it created this little enclosed space underneath, and Chris suggested we stop there and sit for a while. We climbed down the embankment and found a relatively flat spot to sit where we could see up at the bridge structure above us and out across the landscape. It felt private and hidden, like we'd found a secret room that existed outside of normal space and time, and I felt this rush of affection for Chris for bringing me here, for always finding these special places and sharing them with me. We started kissing there under the bridge, gentle at first, but quickly becoming more passionate as we responded to each other and to the setting. His hands moved over my body and mine over his, both of us getting increasingly intimate and physical despite the uncomfortable ground and the industrial setting around us. There was something about the combination of the hidden location and the slight danger of being somewhere abandoned that made everything feel more intense and charged than it would have in a normal setting. We moved from sitting to lying down on the sloped gravel, trying to find comfortable positions while also becoming increasingly focused on each other and less aware of our surroundings. At some point, we moved back up onto the bridge itself because the ground underneath was too uncomfortable and uneven, climbing back up the embankment and walking out onto the wooden ties between the rails. Looking back now, I cannot believe how stupid and reckless this was, how completely we'd abandoned any sense of caution or self-preservation, but in the moment it felt spontaneous and romantic. We lay down on the wooden ties between the metal rails, using Chris's jacket as a makeshift blanket, and continued being intimate, both of us completely absorbed in each other and in the experience. The tracks felt solid and permanent underneath us, and in our ignorance and foolishness, we somehow convinced ourselves they were truly abandoned, that no trains had run here in so long that there was no danger whatsoever. We'd been there for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, deeply engaged with each other and paying absolutely zero attention to anything else, when I became aware of a sound that cut through everything. A low rumbling that seemed to be coming from far away, but getting gradually louder. At first, my brain couldn't process what it was, couldn't connect the sound to any real threat, but then Chris went rigid beneath me and said, "Oh fuck," in a tone I'd never heard from him before, a tone of pure fear and realization. I looked up, and in the distance, maybe half a mile away, I could see lights approaching along the tracks, and the rumbling sound was getting noticeably louder with each passing second. A train. An actual train was coming toward us on these supposedly abandoned tracks, and we were lying directly in its path. The terror that hit me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was pure animal panic, that fight-or-flight response that overrides all rational thought and just floods your body with adrenaline. We scrambled up, both of us tangling in clothes and the jacket and each other, trying to get off the tracks, but for a crucial few seconds, just getting in each other's way and wasting time we didn't have. I could feel the vibration in the rails now, could hear that the rumbling had transformed into a roar, could see that the lights were getting closer way too fast. Chris grabbed my hand and we ran, stumbling over the uneven railroad ties, my feet catching and tripping because I wasn't looking where I was going, just running blind with terror toward the side of the tracks. The train's horn blasted, so loud it felt like it was inside my skull, and I knew the engineer had seen us, knew they were trying to warn us to get out of the way, but I also knew trains can't stop quickly. That even if they'd seen us and hit the brakes immediately, we might not have enough time. We reached the edge of the tracks and basically threw ourselves down the gravel embankment, half sliding and half falling, landing in a heap at the bottom just as the train roared past where we'd been lying seconds before. The ground shook with the weight and speed of it, and the noise was overwhelming, and I could feel the rush of air it created as tons of metal hurtled past at high speed. We lay there in the dirt and gravel at the bottom of the embankment, both of us breathing so hard we were almost hyperventilating, hearts pounding so violently I could feel mine hammering against my ribs. The train kept going, car after car passing on the tracks above us, and I counted them without really meaning to, some disconnected part of my brain just tracking that there were at least 30 or 40 freight cars going by. It took maybe 3 or 4 minutes for the entire train to pass, and then the red lights on the back car disappeared into the distance, and we were left in silence again, except for the ringing in my ears and our ragged breathing. Chris started laughing, this high-pitched, almost hysterical sound that wasn't really about humor at all, but about releasing the tension and terror. He kept saying, oh my God," over and over, and I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face while my whole body shook uncontrollably. He pulled me against him, and we just held each other, both trembling, both processing how close we'd just come to dying, how we'd been seconds away from being hit by a freight train because we were too busy sXXing to pay attention to our surroundings. After maybe 10 or 15 minutes, we finally felt steady enough to stand up, and we made our way back to Chris's car without speaking, both of us too shaken to even attempt conversation. The walk back felt surreal, like we were moving through a dream, or like the world wasn't quite solid anymore. Everything looked the same as it had when we'd walked out here an hour ago, but we were completely different, transformed by the near-death experience we'd just survived through our own stupidity and carelessness. In the car, Chris tried to start the engine, but his hands were shaking too badly to get the key in the ignition. It took him 3 tries before he managed it, and then we just sat there for another few minutes, neither of us quite ready to drive or move or do anything except process what had happened. Finally, Chris said, "I'm so sorry. I almost got us killed," and his voice cracked on the last word. I told him it wasn't just his fault, that I'd chosen to go there and to do what we were doing, that we'd both made terrible decisions together. But even as I said it, I was angry. Angry at him for bringing me there, angry at myself for not asking more questions or thinking through the risks, angry at both of us for being so reckless with our own lives. He drove me home and walked me to my door, and we stood there in the hallway of my apartment building just looking at each other, both clearly wanting to say something meaningful, but neither of us knowing what that would be. Eventually, Chris said, "I'll call you tomorrow," and I nodded, and he left, and I went inside and immediately broke down crying again, this time from relief and residual fear and the weight of realizing how differently this night could have ended. I couldn't sleep that night, just lay in bed replaying everything over and over, seeing those lights approaching, feeling that moment of panic when I realized what was happening, reliving the scramble to get off the tracks and the roar of the train passing so close to where we'd been. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the train and felt that terror all over again, so eventually I just gave up on sleeping and sat up reading, trying to distract myself with anything that would take my mind away from the railway tracks. The next day I called my best friend and told her what had happened, and her reaction was exactly what I needed. She was horrified and angry and told me in no uncertain terms how stupid and reckless we'd been, how we could have died, how she couldn't believe I'd put myself in that kind of danger. She didn't try to make me feel better or minimize what had happened, and I appreciated that honesty, appreciated having someone reflect back to me how serious this was and how lucky I was to still be alive and unharmed. When Chris called later that day, his voice sounded different, more serious and subdued than I'd ever heard him. He said he'd been up all night thinking about what happened, about how he'd almost gotten me killed with his suggestion to go to the tracks, about how he needed to be more responsible and thoughtful about the activities he suggested and the risks he took. I told him I agreed, that we both needed to make better choices, that the thrill-seeking and danger-chasing had to have some kind of limits and boundaries based on actual safety rather than just whether something seemed abandoned or forgotten. The days following the incident were strange and difficult. I found myself feeling anxious and jumpy in ways I hadn't been before, startling at sudden noises, feeling uncomfortable in situations that involved any kind of risk or uncertainty. I avoided walking near train tracks, even the active ones in the middle of the city with crossing guards and signals, the sight and sound of trains triggering immediate anxiety and flashbacks to that night. Chris was dealing with his own processing of the trauma, becoming more withdrawn and less spontaneous, clearly struggling with guilt about his role in what happened. About 2 weeks after the tracks, Chris and I had a long, serious conversation about our relationship and what kind of couple we wanted to be going forward. We talked about the pattern we'd fallen into of seeking out edgy and potentially dangerous experiences, about how that had been exciting initially, but had nearly killed us. About whether we could maintain the spark and adventure in our relationship while also making smarter and safer choices. We decided that we wanted to stay together, but that we needed to fundamentally change how we approached activities and adventures, being more thoughtful about risks and more honest about our comfort levels and boundaries. In the months that followed, our relationship did change in significant ways. Chris became more cautious and protective, always checking in with me about whether I felt safe and comfortable before suggesting activities, taking my concerns seriously instead of brushing them off as me being too worried. I became more assertive about speaking up when something felt wrong or dangerous, trusting my instincts instead of overriding them to seem cool or adventurous. We still explored the city together, but in safer ways, during daylight, in places that were actually open to public, with better preparation and awareness of our surroundings. 6 months later, I still thought about the railway tracks regularly, still had occasional nightmares about trains and lights approaching in darkness, still felt a clutch of anxiety whenever I heard that distinctive rumble of a train. But I'd also processed it enough to understand what the experience had taught me, that some risks aren't worth taking no matter how romantic or exciting they seem in the moment, that trust in a partner doesn't mean abandoning your own judgment about safety, and that youth and adventure aren't excuses for recklessness and stupidity. I'd learned these lessons at nearly the highest possible cost, coming within seconds of paying with my life for the temporary thrill of being somewhere forbidden. Chris and I are still together now, over a year later, and we're stronger for having survived that experience and learned from it together. We look back on the railway tracks as the moment our relationship grew up, the moment we both realized that being a couple meant taking responsibility for each other's safety and well-being, not just enabling each other's worst impulses. We still seek out adventure and unique experiences, but we do it thoughtfully now, with proper planning and safety considerations, and we've found that can be just as rewarding as the reckless spontaneity we used to chase. The railway tracks taught us that excitement and safety aren't mutually exclusive, that you can be adventurous while also being smart, and that the best thrills are the ones you survive to remember and learn from.